I wanted to take a moment to tell you all why I'm doing this event. It is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and that is a reason in and of itself. But I recently became aware of a domestic violence situation within my own personal network, and I'm sad to say that I had no idea. Approximately 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men have experienced severe physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. Approximately 1 in 2 women and 1 in 2 men have experienced psychological aggression by an intimate partner in their lifetime. And approximately 1 in 3 women and 1 in 2 men have experienced coercive control by an intimate partner in their lifetime. And these statistics make it clear that many of you may be in the same situation I was in. You may know someone who needs your support. You may be a survivor. You may be currently experiencing abuse, or you may be an abuser looking for help to break your own patterns. Tonight, we'll talk about what is considered domestic violence under the law, some of the warning signs to recognize an abuser, when to involve the police and what that process looks like, legislation, and what you can do to advocate for appropriate laws, and most importantly, how you can get help. I am so grateful and so glad to have this amazing panel here tonight for this discussion. If you have any questions as we go, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. If you are on Facebook, please write them in the comment section and we'll answer everyone at the end. And if by chance we run out of time, we will get an answer to you. So please join me in welcoming Suzanne Adam, and she's the Executive Director of the Domestic Violence Crisis Center. Wave, Suzanne. Lieutenant Terry Blake, who, oh, I'm sorry, I put my notes somewhere else. He is a lieutenant with the Norwalk Police Department and a member of the Norwalk Domestic Violence Task Force. We have Dr. Wendy Levy, a clinical forensic psychologist with the Yale School of Medicine, and she is a member of the Westport Domestic Violence Task Force. And Captain Rob Cipolla, who is a member of the Wilton DV Task Force and Captain of Operations with the Wilton Police Department. And we have so much to cover that I want to jump right in. But before we start, I would love to just hear a sentence or two of why this work is important to each of our panelists, or why you're here tonight. And I'll start with you, Suzanne.
Hi, thank you so much for having us here tonight. It really, truly is a delight. My simple reason is people deserve to be safe. People deserve to be respected and loved, especially in their personal relationships. And I also believe that everyone needs to be able to make decisions about their lives from a place of information and informed decision instead of a space of fear. No one should have to choose between their safety and those they love, between their safety and their education, between their safety and their children. And I really feel it's important that we come together as a community, which you are doing tonight, this evening, just to show not only our community, but those that we love, that we believe them, we respect them, and that we are here for them when they need us.
Thank you for that. Lieutenant Blake.
Yes, good evening. Again, thank you for having us all tonight on this during this important month, and discussing an important topic. And to echo Suzanne's what Suzanne had to say, we at the Norwalk Police Department, I'm sure all the local police departments are here to serve and to protect our communities. And certainly, we all see far too much of domestic violence and the effects it has on the community as a whole, and certainly the individuals and the families that are torn apart. So it's been part of my job, and certainly something that's important to me as a member of the Norwalk DV Task Force, to do everything I can to help educate the public on this topic.
Thank you. And Dr. Levy? Oops, you're muted. The catchphrase of 2020 and 2021.
it occurred to me that I went to my first domestic violence, it was a booth about over 20 years ago. Because I was working as a I started a domestic violence program in the Hill Health Center, which is a health service program in New Haven. And at the time, I was asked to start a DV program, and I remember now, just sitting here, that the first time I did this was 20 some years ago, and it was all very new to me. Unfortunately, it is not very new to me now, and by being a forensic and a clinical psychologist, I see people in my office who are going, my patients, my clients who are going through, trauma and domestic violence, as well as other things. But I'm also a forensic psychologist. So when people are arrested for, oftentimes for being a victim of domestic violence, I will explain the process to the court and offer, and help with mitigating their sentences and I think that one of my jobs is to educate the court and educate the people, because judges, attorneys don't understand domestic violence, particularly coercive control, which is, I'm delighted that, as you guys will be talking about later, is finally being recognized in Connecticut. And so I think that is part of my job. And that's one of the things that I enjoy doing that.
And I know we've received a question in advance about the new law, so we will be talking about it later. And Captain Cipolla.
Thank you for having me here tonight. As police, we respond to a range of calls for service, and unfortunately, speaking from here in the town of Wilton, when you get away from your rudimentary traffic enforcement type calls, domestic related instances are one of the more common, frequent calls for service we respond to. And quite frankly, it's really probably the most important work we'll do as police, because we are in a unique position in those situations. Domestic violence happens amongst family and household members. These are people that are not unfamiliar with each other. It involves long-standing relationships, and as police, we're uniquely positioned to restore a sense of security and safety for those victims, as well as connect them with resources like the Domestic Violence Crisis Center, who can ultimately get them towards the path of keeping themselves safe and their families safe.
Thank you. So domestic violence, and I've said this to all of you separately, I feel like people always conjure up what I call like a Hollywood image of a broken arm, a black eye, and we don't think of things like coercive control or, being spit on or stalking or fill in the blank. Suzanne, can you tell us how DVCC defines domestic violence?
Absolutely. Domestic violence is about control. It's one individual wanting to have power and control over another individual. And it typically is a pattern of behavior. It can include, as you explained, a broken arm, black and blue bruises, but very typically it includes verbal abuse, which are put downs. It can be technology, where someone is using technology to stalk you, to find you, to harass you, to threaten you. It also can be sexual abuse, where people aren't being able to make their own choices about their physical or sexual health, or even making decisions about how and what they would like to do with their partner. It is pervasive, it is life-threatening, and it is a crime. A lot of people don't think about domestic violence being a crime. Domestic violence is a crime. We have two wonderful police officers here tonight. It's a crime. It's against the law. And the focus very often is on the victim. Why do they stay? Why do they allow someone to be abused? And what we can do as a community is stand up and pay attention to those signs that we may notice with our friends, our neighbors, our colleagues, and support them and ask them if they're okay. Because those patterns of abuse, emotional abuse, verbal abuse, over time, it weighs someone down. Very often people are isolated within these personal relationships from friends, from neighbors, from even colleagues at work. and their support system slowly gets whittled away. And that therefore can impact their self-esteem, can impact their relationship with their family members, their relationships with their children. Very often victims are left feeling scared. They're very often left feeling confused and dependent on their abusive partner. They're also left feeling insecure about their ability to survive without that partner on their own, financially or otherwise. And that's domestic violence in a nutshell.
Thank you. Before I move on, you just touched upon something that I listened in on another workshop that DVCC was hosting a week or so ago, and they talked about, and although it's not the main focus of today, I think it's worth mentioning briefly, they talked about the impact of domestic violence on children in the home. Is there any, like, sort of a 1-minute version of, anything relevant for this group that would be helpful to know?
Absolutely. Children who grow up witnessing domestic violence have their own unique trauma throughout that experience. They typically are called secondary victims. I, as a person who has been working with children my entire professional life, how can we say there's a primary and a secondary victim? Children are victims of what they're living in their home. They don't have a choice. Their parents are there to love and protect them. And very often, one or other parent, and sometimes both, aren't taking care of the children because the child is being exposed to domestic violence. Now, again, the focus should not be on the victim who's experiencing something. We need to normalize the behavior for children to understand what's happening in their home is wrong. We need to normalize their feelings, that they may have conflicting feelings, that they may love a parent, and they also may hate and even be sad or fearful of some parents. And that's where the wonderful work that Dr. Levy does that helps people heal those traumatic experiences that they've experienced. Domestic violence affects over 15 million children across our nation. Very often we have found that children who are exposed to domestic violence as a child may grow up to be an abused person, a victim as they grow up, or they may become a perpetrator, someone who perpetrates violence and control other people. So it's really important that we realize that the sooner children get help, and studies show this and research shows this, the sooner a child can get help to understanding what these patterns are and what's happening in their home. Additionally, safety planning with children. What can we do when a child's experiencing domestic violence? I worked firsthand with police officers many years ago where they were clearing the house after a domestic violence incident, and there's a child underneath the bed holding a weapon, and the police officer just peeked underneath the bed. The child hid. They knew exactly what to do, but they did not know because they were brainwashed into thinking that the police were going to hurt the parents instead of the police being helpers. It's really important that we also acknowledge that the police officers going out to these, it's not a case, it's a call. It's the most dangerous case, the most dangerous call they'll ever answer, because you never know what you're going to experience. And children have that same experience. So the sooner we can get them help, DVCC has a dedicated youth and family counselor to help the parent, to help the children, and to help both and all family members navigate these dangerous relationships so they can be safe when they are at home.
Thank you for that. And Rob, you touched upon this a little bit in your opening remarks. I would love for our community, my district, Norwalk, Wilton, Westport, if you could give us a sense of the prevalence of these types of calls. You said it could be, you get many calls, and Terry, same thing for Norwalk. If you can just give us a sense of perhaps the type of DV calls you're getting and the numbers. Are there any stats you have that you can share?
Sure. So in the town of Wilton, we when we classify our calls for service that are domestic related, we bifurcate them in the sense that we have our totality of domestic related calls, and then our calls that actually meet the definition of a family violence crime per Connecticut statute. And I know we'll talk a lot about coercive control and the expansion of legislation and how that allows a victim to apply for restraining orders. But in terms of our family violence crime definition, we're still on that level of, an act of violence, bodily injury, stalking, those types of behaviors. So in the town of Wilton, year to year, generally we have 80 to 100 domestic related calls. Of those, I'd say between 30 and 40 a year meet that threshold of a family violence crime. And on the topic of children, being present as not involved, just present for these incidents, as I say, nearly 50% of our family violence crimes, there is a child present in the household or in the vicinity of where there has just been an act of violence involving typically, parents.
Thank you. And Terry?
Yeah, certainly in Norwalk, we do see a prevalence of domestic violence incidents. I think, as I share with you, Representative Thomas, during the pandemic, the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, we actually saw a drop in statistics as opposed to 2019, which was concerning. Certainly a hypothesis we came up with is that, the victims were now at home with the abusers and unable to call for assistance, unable to find a way to even tell a friend or what have you, kind of, as Suzanne had mentioned, under control, being fully controlled by the abuser that is no longer leaving the residence for any reason. So that was certainly concerning for us. And, the DV task force in Norwalk, we certainly did a lot to try and make people aware of that. And again, the domestic violence responses that we get as far as our calls for service are certainly high and continue to be, somewhat high on a month by month basis. We have a large city, all sorts of different demographics, and certainly a concern of ours, again, under-reporting of these incidents.
No, absolutely. And Dr. Levy, first, feel free to add anything to the definition of domestic violence, but I think people often, you hear them ask, or, family members will ask, well, were there warning signs? How might we know abuse is going on? I would imagine in your work, there is some data around that. Is there a profile or anything that, we can know to look for?
There's, all the psychological characteristics that are part of the coercive control. Suzanne mentioned it, when this is for family members, you're saying, right? When I hate to use the word victim, but then I use the word abusee, which isn't much help either. When, he or she is isolating, is not getting together with family, with friends, always has an excuse. There's a fear. I once did an evaluation on someone, and an evaluation is not a client. So like I only met her that one time for a couple hours. And so I naturally asked her, just taking notes, so did you ever notify the police? And she looked at me like, like she was like a deer with the headlights, because it was like utter fear, is because when you are under intimidation of an abuser, there really is the belief that if you do anything against that person, that you will be hurt, or that it's the end of the world. So she never felt that she could go to the police, and her look said it all. Unfortunately, when you're explaining this to the authorities, they don't quite get it, which is why I'm really glad the coercive control law is coming out now. So there is also a lot of like protecting the abuser. There's the abuser does a lot of what we call paper abuse, in couples getting divorced. There's a lot of paper abuse, going back to court, doing motions. There is one of the characteristics that is for the victim is gaslighting, when the victim starts believing that she that she's going crazy because he said one thing and now he just changed it. And one of the things that Suzanne said is when you feel that you have this bond with the abuser, which is part of that protecting, so the family member sees her protecting, it's like Stockholm syndrome. You know, I can't live with him, but I can't live without him because I don't know what to do without him because he controls everything that I do. So there's no free will anymore. And this is what the family members can see, this dwindling and the dwindling of self-esteem.
And can I just point something else out? A lot of the things that Wendy was talking about are coping skills. People minimize what's happening. They're denying what's happening. They're ignoring what's happening. We all do that. We minimize when we put on a little bit of weight. We deny one more cookie. You know, those are healthy and normal coping skills. What happens is when it goes past that point and you no longer are emotionally or physically safe. I also wanted to point out while we had this opportunity that not every case rises to the time when someone has to call 911. And I think people very often, to use a lack of a better, it's either black or white. We're either calling the police, and my experience, my physical, emotional, verbal experience has to be so bad, I have to call the police. And they're always waiting for that. It's not that moment for it to get worse or worse or worse, or they don't identify with what they've seen on Law or SVU, or what they've recently seen in the papers nationally, what's going on with the case. People need to understand that there are services, whatever you're experiencing, and sometimes it is very appropriate to call the police. And what DVCC does is we help people safety plan. So we will pick up the phone and call. I almost called you Rob, but that is your name, his formal title. Pick up the phone and say, we have an individual who would like to make a statement. We help people connect to police, connect to services in a way that creates a safer environment to them, for them to live in the world that they're living in. You know, Terry and I went live on News 12 to let people know that the police are here. We're not responding to domestic violence or 911 calls any differently than we were during the pandemic. So I urge people, if they suspect or they're worried about a friend or they're worried about themselves, you know, just know that help is a phone call away, and you don't have to figure it out. You don't, do I fit into this bucket? Or am I being verbally abused? Or I'm afraid, or I'm isolated? We can help connect you back to those sources within yourself and those resources within the community to start building the blocks again, so you can start creating a stronger self to withstand what you're experiencing and to live a safer life.
Thank you for that. And I know the police have told me, Rob and Terry have told me as well, that they also, because sometimes a neighbor or an individual may call the police and it may not rise to a certain threshold, but they also are there as a bridge. I would love to know, I mean, I would imagine, I think Dr. Levy said it as well, that when the police are called, tensions are usually very high. But I think most people don't know what happens after the police arrive. Maybe Terry or Rob, can you walk us through what that visit looks like, and even talk a little bit about what the result may be, like in terms of order of protections, restraining orders, etc. And I don't know, I'll go to Terry first.
Okay. Certainly, we certainly respond to any call that anyone calls us reporting some type of disturbance or such. We'll investigate that. I think one of the most important things for everyone to understand is that the idea of pressing charges, oftentimes we'll find a victim that's, especially in the presence of the abuser, makes it very clear, and sometimes even loudly, to let the abuser know that they're not here to press charges, that they are in fact not pressing charges. And again, it's not their fault, which is all part of that control and that fear that Dr. Levy and Suzanne spoke of. You know, we'll investigate and determine if there is any type of problem. Any probable cause to make an arrest, and if there is, we will do so. And ultimately, that's the state pressing charges. That is not the victim pressing charges in that case. The domestic violence laws are such that if there is a threat of violence or an act of violence, there is an arrest that needs to be made. If that offending party is present, we will take that offending party into custody. We'll then develop a safety plan with the victim and give referral services, in our case, to DBCC for that victim, and even make a phone call to a Domestic Violence Crisis Center hotline for the victim with us present, and allow them to talk to a counselor right then and there to try and get them again on some type of path to normalcy and a feeling of safety. We've also evacuated families to safe houses to ensure that they're safe in that moment and will no longer be exposed to that offender. As a follow-up, the offender would go to court during the next court date. They're assigned a next court date, wherever that next court date is. And oftentimes, without question, a protective order is issued by the court on that court date.
And Rob, maybe I get this question a lot. What does this process look like if you're undocumented?
So there's no deviation in the process if you're undocumented. It is important in those situations to let the person know that there shouldn't be a barrier for them reporting the abuse that they're enduring. And a tool that we do have it would be the U visa process, and that's for people whose immigration status may be questionable. It provides them access through petitioning, and what I tell the officers when we train it is all you need to know is that this is available for individuals whose immigration status is questionable, and it shouldn't be a barrier to them. And ultimately connect them to a resource like the Domestic Violence Crisis Center, who can walk them through the process and how to make that application so that it's not a barrier, their immigration status isn't a barrier to report their victimization.
And
sorry,
go ahead, Doctor.
The flip side of that is, and you ask great questions, by the way. So the flip side to that is that oftentimes the abusee feels bad that that the abuser will get in trouble, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the abusers may be deported. There is a threat of deportation for the abuser if he in this case. Am I right?
I have no lawyer on the call. I don't know if
I have
anyone
not.
else.
I have found, I know that is a very real threat, and I do know abusers use that threat against victims, for lack of a better way of explaining it, that they will be deported, they'll be separated from their family. I have not, I can count on my hands very few times that deportation has actually taken place, unless there are extenuating circumstances and someone has a rap sheet very long where it is picked up part of another case, a regular domestic violence. And I would strongly urge people to reach out for counsel and talk to our legal department at DVCC. But that's not something that typically happens where someone is deported right away. Would that be your experience from the police experience, guys?
That's correct. I mean, obviously there's no state immigration department. That's all federal, and there's no reporting on behalf of the state or the local police departments to a federal agency in regards to anyone's immigration status.
And the other part that go ahead, Rob.
No, I was just going to say to the point, I mean, it's a great point and question. I mean, listen, that's the ultimate form of power and control, right? Telling the victim, perhaps, hey, if you report me, you're going to be deported, or I'm going to be deported. And that's why it's so important that our officers know about this U visa process and are able to articulate that and connect with resources, so that the immigration status isn't a means of exerting power and control over a victim, or a barrier for a victim to if they're experiencing abuse, contacting the police and viewing us as a helpful relationship in that process.
Right. And the one thing I want to add to this about what happens the next day. So the police make an arrest. Very often that night, they'll connect someone who's been experiencing abuse in real time to services, calling our hotline, sometimes going into shelter, sometimes simply just safety planning on the phone. And the next day, Connecticut has next day arraignment laws put in place. So if victim of domestic violence gets orders of protection, put in immediately. So if it happens on a Friday, it'll take place on Monday. If it happens on a Tuesday night, it'll take place on Wednesday morning. The victims will get a phone call from one of our victim advocates. We have family violence victim advocates who work both in Norwalk and Stamford Court, and they will ask the victim a number of questions. Do they feel safe? Are there guns in the house? What other pertinent information? Are children involved? There's a court-specific intake that takes place. Victims do not, and in this case, it's a defendant and a victim. The victims do not need to come into court. They do not need to face their abuser. The victim advocates will be their voice and share with the judges, the state's attorney, and the family relations officer the next day what their needs are, what their wants are, and what their concerns are. And our advocates do just that. They advocate for the victim and then goes in before the judge, et cetera, et cetera. Once the case has been heard, the victim advocate then reaches out to the victim and lets him or her know, them know, what happened during court and what orders of protection are in place. Further, once the case will get a new court date, the victim advocates follow the entire case. You are never alone. We're working with the police, we're working with GCF if necessary, we're working with the judicial system. Victims do not have to navigate this system alone, and there are victim advocates in that role specifically for that.
That's great. The advocate system, I know across the board in many areas, it really helps the victims navigate what can be a very complicated process, as we just heard. I want to go back to something, Suzanne, you touched upon, but I think I'll throw it to you, Rob. You know, I think many people just know call police or don't call police. And I think the police would say, if in doubt, call us. So can you talk us through that a little bit? Like, can the police help a victim determine if a crime was committed?
Sure. So, yeah, obviously the message from the police is if you feel your safety is in jeopardy, you know, without a doubt, call the police. With that said, I understand, and for the reasons that we've discussed, these are crimes perhaps that are occurring between family or household members, spouses, dating relationships, you know, siblings. So certainly there's that hesitancy to contact the police because yes, the victim may be enduring abuse, but they don't want to see their offender arrested. That's not the outcome they're looking for. And as police, like Lieutenant Blake discussed, you know, we do have some, you know, mandates in the state of Connecticut in terms of mandatory arrest. We've used tools like the lethality assessment tool to ask very pointed questions when victims, you know, have come in and simply said something like, "Hey, I'm going through a divorce and I'm scared and I don't know why I'm scared." And we ask these very, you know, pointed 11 questions, and it informs the officer, you know, well, this is why they're scared, and it informs the victim too. This is why you're scared because you answered yes, yes, and yes to this. Can we have hypothetical conversations at times? Yes, but you know, as police, we are mandated when we have actionable information involving family violence crimes. We're mandated to make arrests in those situations. Like I said, we have 3 goals as police: education and awareness. That's doing things like we're here tonight doing. Keeping victims safe, and really that's our partnership with the DVCC. And then offender accountability, and that's where, you know, when we go in and we cause an investigation and we determine there's probable cause, you know, our job is through our arrest powers to ensure that offender accountability, at the same time bridging that gap between us and the DVCC and getting that victim resources to ensure their safety.
Thank you for that.
One more thing, Stephanie.
Sure.
That victims can also make a statement the next day. As soon as it is safe. I'm sure, yeah, you're both nodding. Very often there are people just walk into the police station. You can make a statement as soon as it's safe to do so. Sometimes people are so scared to call 911 for their life. It feels counterintuitive, but they're so scared, they wait for the dust to settle, and they are well within their right to, it doesn't have to be live in the moment. that's the best because the police are there to protect you. They're there to keep you safe. And also when very dangerous situations are happening, what we all want out of this is that for the individual to survive the circumstance, the abuse that they're experiencing. But they are more than welcome, and very often that is a safe option, to go to the police station the next day and let the police take a statement. There is still evidence very often. There's the verbal evidence, there's your statement. Things could have happened to your belongings, to your family members. So they can do everything they would have done the night before or the moment before. And that's what makes the police so great, that they're very good at their jobs and helping you stay safe.
The police are great. Thank you again for all of your work every day. I want to give a little bit of airtime. I think many of the victims of domestic violence are women, but there are also sort of these outlier cases, you know, whether it's the elderly or men or same-sex couples, you know, fill in the blank. Dr. Levy, I'm wondering if you can talk about, you know, I think you and Suzanne have both used the word control a couple of times. And I don't know what my question is, but I want people to understand that, you know, you can find domestic violence anywhere, across all ages, across all genders, because it's really rooted in control. Could you speak to that a little bit, or what you've seen in your work?
Well, you know, it used to be that it was all about power and control, and there is this wheel of power and control that was in the grassroots in the domestic violence movement. And the person who coined the coercive control, which is Evan Stark from Connecticut. He actually wrote the grant that got me the job at the Hill Health Center a long time ago. And then he coined the term, and he's quite the scholar now. He's changed the laws in England because of coercive control. And it's insidious, and it's cumulative, and it is a pattern. You know, people will say, well, one time makes domestic violence. Actually, if you look into it, it is a pattern. It is controlling people's schedule. It is controlling how much money they make. It is controlling that they shouldn't get a job, that they should stay home, that they shouldn't make over X amount of money. And in that process, it crosses, ages, gender, even family constellations, because it is insidious, and it is so insidious that the victim doesn't realize that they are being controlled. And DVCC also has a program with teens, and with girls who are dating. It's like, oh, I don't like your hair that way, and your skirt is kind of, so I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but it is control in every aspect, but it's so subtle that one doesn't realize it. And then the control deepens, and then the person doesn't have the power anymore to fight it, or to believe in him or herself that they can transcend this.
I think you answered my question. And I'm sorry, I'm just seeing a question in the chat that I do think is worth bringing up. And it says, why is it the case that so often a female victim's story of abuse is only understood and believed when she is killed, whereas women who act in self-defense to injure or kill their documented abuser quite often are arrested, prosecuted, and are imprisoned? And I realize I'm not familiar enough with Connecticut state law, but I remember decades ago being in California, and it was, I think following the O.J. Simpson case of all things, there was this, whoever had a injury. So perhaps a man would threaten a woman and she might scratch him or something to get away. They could both end up being arrested. Could you address what Connecticut state law is with regard to this?
Guys, I think what you're referring to is primary aggressor. And Connecticut laws come a long way, and anyone jump in with any of this. We at the Domestic Violence Crisis Center have worked with over 3,400 individuals last fiscal year who've experienced domestic violence. We believe you. We believe you. Help is available. I want everyone to hear that. We also work so closely with our partners in the police force, and they are educated, they're informed, they communicate, they investigate. You have to, I'll let you guys talk, but separating the parties at the crime, they do an incredible job. And back in the day, it could have been months, years, but that's called dual arrest, where two people would be arrested because you couldn't tell who did what. Well, the police officers have been given a great deal of education. They've leaned into knowledge. Not that they haven't, but they've been given the tools. Let me put it that way. They've been given the tools they need to be able to determine who that primary aggressor is and whether or not those helpers across the state, domestic violence hotline workers and advocates, are working with victims so they can be safe. Do you guys want to talk about that primary aggressor and who's believed and who's not believed in your experience of it?
Sure, I can jump in. Yeah, prior to 2018, again, with Connecticut having mandatory arrest, we were a state with high dual arrest rates, and that's simply a product of if there was probable cause for both parties that both committed a family violence crime, going back to mandatory arrest, they would both be arrested. Now, I will say, the law, even prior to dominant aggressor, always did have a carve out in there where if you can articulate self-defense, the mandatory arrest, that was an exemption to mandatory arrest. And, you know, I can say here in the town of Wilton, you know, even before 2018, mandatory arrests in domestic violence situations was almost, when it would happen, it was almost like a four-letter word, because you were kind of, you know, ashamed that happened, even though sometimes it's unavoidable. But our officers have always done a good job in doing those thorough investigations, identifying self-defense when it's appropriate, and identifying who the true offender is. And then come 2018, we were given the tool of dominant aggressor, where it relieved us of some of the liability associated with not making that mandatory arrest and being able to do a dominant aggressor analysis, identifying the primary aggressor in a particular incident, and not having to make arrests of both parties, because they're more than likely, now listen, there are some times when there are certainly two mutual combatants in an incident, and those situations are unavoidable. But more often than not, there's someone that's a victim, and when now you've engaged in arresting both parties, it inhibits their ability to engage in helpful resources and services to actually keep that victim safe. And the one thing I'll just add is, I think Suzanne mentioned it earlier, is, these are not isolated incidences. Domestic violence is fluid. Yes, we as the police end up at a call for service in that acute phase because something got so bad that a victim felt that the police needed to be there. But, as police, it's very easy to get into, why are we here tonight? Oftentimes you go to these scenes and you start hearing about what happened yesterday, last week, last month, over the course of years. It's very easy to get tunnel vision and say, ma'am, sir, just the facts, what happened tonight. I need to know what happened tonight. But, what we train our officers is that historical context in these situations is so important. It's one of the key elements in determining a dominant aggressor in a particular incident, and being able to use that legislation that was passed in 2018 to ultimately prevent dual arrest situations.
Anything to add, Terry?
No, I think Captain Cipolla covered it all. I mean, that tool that we were given, in the law, certainly, I think, helps to protect the victims of domestic violence.
Right. And I think another piece to add to this is document. Talk to your friends. If you document on Wednesday, September 16th, you were beaten, or you were hurt, or your property was destroyed, and then you're taking pictures, you're saving it at a friend's house, you're giving it to your parents' house, you're bringing it to an advocate at a local domestic violence program. If you're documenting, that is also another wonderful tool that the police can use, that the courts can use, and that your advocates can use to help advocate for you, whether you need a criminal or civil protective order, also to show those patterns of abuse over time. So documenting very often can be a lifesaver as well.
And I'd like to add back to that question. If, the best effort and the person is still prosecuted, or at least, or is arrested and is prosecuted, that's when, good legal help is very important. And I think I'm trying to look, I was reading here in the new law that they are trying to expand, free legal services, not just with DVCC, but for victims of domestic violence. And these lawyers will know to get the history. And that's when I get called sometimes, is to show that this is a pattern of control through many years, and which led up to this. And then to explain why she defended. I have worked with women who had to kill their perpetrators because that was total self-defense. And fortunately, this was heard by the court. So there's so many steps to this, and not everybody gets a reasonable police force. Sometimes it goes beyond that. So, but there is, I think the more we can educate, not just, potential victims and perpetrators, but also the legal system. And I think that that's very helpful.
So that's a perfect segue to SB 1091, which some people call Jennifer's Law, which passed this past session and went into effect October 1st of this year. We had a question submitted in advance. I know none of you are lawyers, but they wanted to know regarding Jennifer's Law, what is the pattern of behavior that defines coercive control? And I know we touched upon it a little bit, but maybe Dr. Levy or anybody, if you have any clear-cut examples of what people should be aware of, is now covered in this new law.
Let me read to you. This is what I always write on my reports. I should know it by heart, but just in case. Domestic violence is defined as a pattern of coercive control characterized by the use of physical, sexual, and psychologically abusive behaviors in which the abuser forces the abusee to live with a constant sense of danger and expectation. That is the coercive control, is the fear, is hearing the footsteps, knowing when he opens the door downstairs, just by the way he opened the door and started going up the stairs, this is going to be a bad night. Whatever I say, well, he's going to get on my case. This is going to be horrible. It is that sense of danger and expectation. And it is so heightened that an onlooker wouldn't understand, what are you talking about? He just came in the house. But these are the small examples of that. Suzanne, I'll let you give another example.
Yeah, I think the most important thing about this law is that it does expand the definition of domestic violence. That includes coercive control as a form of domestic violence. It wasn't just physical or emotional. Coercive control is that untenable feeling that people get over time. It also allows victims to subject coercive control by a family member in order to be eligible for civil restraining orders. It also, this is the grant protection program that you were alluding to, Wendy, that there is a legal assistance program for individuals to help with this. The most important thing for people to understand is that the definition of domestic violence has been expanded to include coercive control, which impacts victims' lives every single day. I am making decisions about my life not because I choose to. I have been coerced to being a brunette instead of being a blonde. I've been coerced in giving my finances, my access to my finances to somebody else. I've been coerced into sex. People understand that when you've been coerced into sex, you don't want to, but there's coercion there. That's easier for people to understand than coercive control when it pertains to domestic violence. And with domestic violence, it impacts every aspect of your life, your physical life, your emotional, your psychological, your health, your ability to relate to others. So it is that walking on eggshells. And what this law shows is that that pattern of coerce over control can be used in a civil and in a criminal manner. It empowers the police to use this as a tool when they go out for a case or a call, and it empowers advocates, judges, and lawyers to use this as well. The challenging time right now is it's new. We don't have a lot of case law, so everyone is being trained in real time. Judges, police officers, advocates, including victims, we're all reading about this in the paper. A great deal of education is happening across the state throughout the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And we're very lucky. Connecticut consistently has been in the forefront of domestic violence laws and protecting victims of domestic violence. We're very lucky in that sense. And the education is there, and the police can do their jobs, and the advocates can support that to create a safer environment for all victims.
And I looked it up, and in the House anyway, 134 people voted for that bill, 8 voted against it. You're leading me to the next question because it came up during the debate. It is so new. It's so insidious for the victim, but hard for others to often see and understand. And I'm just curious from a police perspective, either what you're learning in training or any challenges you see with like documenting that and helping a victim build a case. Or would that really be handled by the judge at a later time? Go ahead, Terry.
I mean, I think like any other investigation, it's imperative or very important for the victim in this case to be as forthright and upfront and as detailed as they can be, whether in the moment or after meeting with an advocate and remembering other events that may have occurred. As Suzanne alluded to, certainly documentation of what's going on in life or patterns of abuse as it's happening, even if they don't feel comfortable at the moment to contact us, are important. It certainly helps us document and build a case against an offender if that's what is appropriate at that time. And again, as Suzanne alluded to, this is all new. It's a new law, and we are working hard to ensure that our officers are trained on it.
Thank you. Yes, we are on day 25. So I'm glad to know that people are getting trained. We also passed an expansion of the red flag laws so that firearms are not automatically returned after the end of a year. If we still think there's a threat, the person poses a threat. I'm curious, we've touched upon it a couple of times, this distinction between civil and criminal. And I know we're getting close to our end time, but I would love if Rob or Terry, you can talk about what these civil or criminal cases are comprised of, I suppose is the right way to formulate.
I think what you may be referring to is orders of protection.
Correct.
So, there's several different classifications of orders of protection. The one that we police, see most frequently is when we've made a family violence arrest and that person, the offender, is arraigned in court the next day. After the family violence victim advocate contacts the victim of the offense and talks about what would be best to be in that criminal order of protection to keep them, to ultimately ensure their safety. A criminal order of protection is issued, and that can be something as little as do not threaten, harass, stalk, physically assault the victim, or it could be something on the other end, where complete no contact order, not within 100 yards. Those are always, I've never seen one that not issued after a criminal family violence arrest. Next day arraignment, order of protection issued. The civil process is a little different, where an individual, a victim, can petition the court for a civil ex parte restraining order, and that there perhaps could be no police involvement in that case of a criminal nature. And ultimately, the person is going to family court. And again, this is where I say, there's any hesitancy in contacting the police at that moment in time, contact the DVCC, because they'll literally, hold the person's hand and walk them through that process and how to do that. And where they can petition with a sworn affidavit, and a judge will sign off on an ex parte order, which protects that victim just like a criminal protective order would, but it does it immediately upon notice. Now a marshal would have to serve the defendant in the case with that order of protection, and then they will have an opportunity to be heard within 14 days or within 7 days if there's indication that there's firearms present. So those are the two different tracks. And when we were talking about coercive control and the expansion of domestic violence, what it does is it now includes that definition as a means for a victim to get that civil restraining order if they can articulate in their sworn affidavit elements of coercive control.
That's great. And oh, go ahead, Suzanne.
Can I just add, your colleague, Representative Porter, was so helpful in sending us an answer. And I thought, since we're spending so much time on coercive control, that I really explained the definition and really quickly here, that coercive control under the Act includes unreasonably isolating your family member or household member from friends, relatives, or other support. We touched upon that. That's in the law now. Depriving a family member or household member of basic necessities, food, finances, family members, their job. Controlling, regulating, or monitoring the family or household members' movements, their communications, their daily behavior, their finances, economic resources, or access to services. Compelling the family or household members by force, threat, intimidation, including threats based on actual or suspected immigration status, to engage the conduct for which they have a right to abstain, or to abstain from conduct that they have a right to pursue. I don't want to do that. You can't force me. I do want to do that. You can't force me. Also, committing or threatening to commit cruelty to animals that intimidates. If someone threatened my cat's spot, I would be horrified, and I probably would do what they asked me to do. But committing or threatening to hurt an animal is included. Forcing the performance of sex acts or making threats of a sexual nature, including threatened acts of sexual conduct, or based on threats based on someone's sexuality, or threats to release sexual images. And I bet through that definition of what we just described, a lot of people are going to be recognizing themselves, recognizing aspects of their relationships that fit into those pieces. And again, it's a repetition, unnecessary, harmful behavior, which is what coercive control is now. So I thank you very much, Representative Porter, for supporting us in our meeting tonight.
And I will take a moment to thank my colleague, Representative Porter, just for her voice on this issue over the years. So we are sending a silent thank you. And I know we've spoken about this offline. So this is actually a great segue to my wrap-up question, which I think for you, Suzanne, what type of legislation does DVCC have on the radar? As you said, Connecticut has passed many laws, and even nationally, there are a lot of laws now in most states. Is there anything that you see that still needs to get done to help victims?
Yeah, absolutely. The two most important things that as a state, the member agencies, we're 18 member organizations across the state providing services to victims of domestic violence as part of the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And this coming year, we are asking the state to fund over 18 full-time child and family advocates. That's one full-time person for every agency across the state, which means children across the state will get the trauma-informed care they need. If you look at the funding we currently have, each child receiving our services gets 2.5 hours a year a year of services. It's over $11,000 each agency gets. Instead of having $11,000 for a part-time, part-time position, we're looking for each organization to have a full-time position to really support the children, processing their traumatic experience, and preventing the cycle of abuse to continue by educating them about domestic violence. We have noticed the change, I'm sure we all have, with our families, with our neighbors, with our colleagues, with our community, that impact the pandemic has had on us. But the impact of the pandemic has compounded a child's experience. Imagine being stuck at home on a Zoom or a Google Meet as a second grader, a kindergarten, or ninth grader, exposed to the abuse that was happening when you were at home, and now you're living with it 24 hours a day. We really need to be sure that we are here for our kids. We need to make sure they are physically and emotionally safe. And the best way we can do that is to provide those services by that full-time, just one full-time position for each organization that provides these critical services to kids. And the other aspect of what we're looking for is to increase essential services through a VOCA fix. I'm sure many people are aware that there are gaps in the federal government, the Victims of Crime Act, and because there is a gap in the Victims of Crime Act funding, that will impact the victim advocates that we are talking about who can support you in court. That is impacting the adult advocates who are there answering the hotlines and safety planning with people. So we're looking to fill that gap that we would not be receiving from the federal government, so we can maintain these life-saving critical services for victims of domestic violence across the state.
Thank you. And you have at least 2 state representatives on this meeting, Rob or Terry. From a police perspective, anything that you would like to see legislatively? And you can say no.
The one thing I'll touch on is, we talked about dual arrest and the dominant aggressor, and that was definitely a tool that helped us. What it doesn't avoid still is a situation where perhaps the true victim in that relationship just has a bad night, and certainly there is this whole historical context that we can articulate about coercive control and elements of abuse that have occurred over the weeks, months, years to this victim. But on that particular evening or day, they were the one that committed an act of violence, and we are still mandated in that situation to make that mandatory arrest when perhaps it truly is, the victim in that relationship when you look at historically. But in that one-off date that we got called, we still are mandated to make that arrest when it's a single complaint, and there aren't those dual complaints at that particular moment.
I know this isn't a public hearing, but that raises the question, just anecdotally in your experience, if, which do you think is more helpful? Are there more cases where that is the case or is not the case?
No, I would say that's the rarity.
The exception.
But there are still those pockets where that does happen, and again, that perhaps impedes the victim's ability to engage some of the services that they may need.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And Terry?
It may be a whole separate night for discussion. However, I think finding funding in relation to mental health and or substance abuse, we see a tremendous amount of, at least in Norwalk, folks that are involved in DV that are also involved with substance abuse or mental health issues. And it's a chicken or egg thing, right? Was there a mental health issue before they were having this ongoing cycle of abuse or not? I don't know. As Suzanne just alluded to, how are you helping a child with a couple hours over a course of a year? You're really not, right? So I think it's imperative that the state, would look to finding some additional funding for communities across Connecticut, because again, domestic violence transcends town and city lines, and every demographic, every socioeconomic group. So I think it's certainly a way to try and assist all the citizens of Connecticut with those issues as it relates to domestic violence.
That is a really important point, and as you say, that could be an entirely different, evening. So thank you for mentioning that. And Dr. Levy, I don't want to leave you out. Any legislative fixes on your radar?
Well, I'm trying to be hopeful here. We've come a long way. There was a time that you couldn't have, there are, like when I was at Yale, we were having an SADV program, substance abuse domestic violence program for the perpetrators. I mean, we're talking about the victims, but we also have to educate the perpetrators, and so that and deal with their mental health issues and their substance abuse issues. And so we've come a long way. We now put them together in the same room. We should have more programs on the substance abuse and domestic violence and mental health. I mean, I am so for that. So it's a great idea.
I'm sure it'll be added to a long list. I know we are slightly over time, so I will, and I don't see any more questions in the chat. So I will turn it over, same order. Actually, I'll do a reverse order. Any final words? And I'll start with you, Rob. Final thoughts for our audience.
No, I'll just reiterate what said previously. As a police, we serve multiple purposes in this arena. With offender accountability, obviously being one of them, but our paramount concern is victim safety, and that is our partnerships with the BVCC and bridging that gap between what we do as police, establishing probable cause, is there a crime, do we need to make an arrest, and then ultimately doing that warm handoff to the BVCC to do that safety planning and all those things that keep victims safe.
Thank you. Dr. Levy, final thoughts.
My thoughts are not about the legislation necessarily, but I want to remind people that domestic violence presumes that there is a lot of trauma, and that trauma is also a repetitive pattern. And so that's why it's so important to have the mental health services, because to help heal the trauma.
Lieutenant Blake.
Yeah, I just think it's important. Certainly, there's been a rift around the country with law enforcement as it relates to the communities. And just to remind the community members, every law enforcement officer in America is a community member. We also could be victims or experience victims of family violence as well. So just understand that we are there to serve. We are there to protect the community. And just because we're wearing uniform doesn't mean that we're not your neighbor. We're not your moms, dads, sisters, brothers, grandparents, and so on.
Thank you. And Suzanne, final word.
I really appreciated what Wendy just brought up about abusive individuals. Very often in our work, we find that victims, don't want to leave the relationship. They want the abuse to stop. Isn't that what we all just want? They want the abuse to stop. So I think looking for remedies where we are finding solutions for the whole person, for the whole family, not one or the other, or the third party, or the primary, or the secondary. We're looking for solutions for everybody, which impacts their criminal life, their civil life, their ability to be a parent, their ability to be a good person who can contribute to a society, their ability to smile and wake up and feel good about themselves every day. And I think the last thing I'd love everyone to know, to take away, help is available. We're a phone call, we're a text, we're a hug away from anybody who needs help.
And I'm going to repeat that phone or text number, 888, and write it down. Give it to people who may need it. 888-774-2900. And I am so grateful to all of you for taking time out tonight and for all the incredible work you honestly do every day in this space. Lieutenant Blake, Captain Sapola, Dr. Levy, thank you. Suzanne, Adam, Domestic Violence Crisis Center, thank you for everything. I think I speak for most of my colleagues. We think this is important work, so please do keep us in mind if you see there are things that the state can do to help this population. And thank you everyone for joining. Thank you to my incredible team for putting all the logistics together, and to our fantastic translator, Luz. Have a good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Be well, everyone.